If you've ever thought that someone needed to make a game where your progress is directly tied to the amount of villagers you slaughter, then you'd actually find two of them, which is kind of funny. But even funnier is that in 2022, a new contender arrived to the genre that I just made up, and Soulash was released. Soulash is like Skyrim if every NPC decided to murder you on sight, and crafting was run by a slot machine. The game's premise is that you play as a reincarnated god whose goal is to devour as many souls as possible. If that sounds remotely interesting to you, then I'm glad, because it did to me too, but after putting a few hours into the game, I have some thoughts on how it all comes together. The game starts by presenting you with three difficulty options. All three of these options change the game in the ways you'd expect them to, like giving enemies better stats and so on. You can actually adjust the modifiers for each difficulty level to find a sweet spot for yourself, with the only penalty for doing so being less points to your final score after the run is over. After picking a difficulty setting, we move on to character creation, where you pick a class, a race, and allocate your stat points. There are 17 playable races in Soulash, all of them having slight stat and playstyle affinities, like humans being decent at everything, vampires consuming blood instead of food, orcs being very strong, etc. Aside from a few examples like the Jinn or Lich, most races interact with the world and its mechanics in pretty much the same way. There's no different dialogue from enemies based on your character's race, there's no special interactions or anything like that, and gameplay-wise there isn't much mechanical variety between them either. The most important, and maybe the only thing to consider when picking your character's race, is their trait, as it's pretty much the only thing that will affect your playstyle. While playing, I tended to lean towards characters with infravision or far-sighted, because without them, the game is set on Vardenfell, and I can only see 5 meters in front of me at all times. There are 8 classes in Soulash, with 3 of them being melee-focused, 2 ranged classes, and another 2 that sort of act like hybrid classes. Each of these are pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure you can tell what a necromancer or a barbarian does by their names, but one thing to note is that the balance in this game slightly favors ranged and hybrid classes, while pure melee ones tend to suffer the most. The 3 melee classes, Berserker, Nomad, and Knight, are all by nature different flavors of walking up to enemies and beating them to death. This means that they end up having to trade significantly more damage than their ranged counterparts, as a mage or an archer can get away with kiting enemies, or at least getting a few hits off before getting into biting range. I find that during the early game in particular, as a melee class, you end up having to stop halfway through an encounter to run away and go take a nap, because those villagers hurt and you need to heal. Visually, Soulash is a pretty nice looking game. It has a simple 2D sprite set similar to Dwarf Fortress or Caves of Quud that was apparently only added in a later patch, and the game has some nice visual details like environmental animations in the world, and other minor things like your character getting progressively bloodier throughout combat encounters. There's also a decent amount of location variety in the world. Cities, deserts, caves, forests, and dungeons, while being pretty standard as far as environments go, are what you'll see a lot of, though you do end up visiting more visually interesting locations later on. But while the map is big, it has to be said that large portions of it are just grass and trees with little settlements and encounters sprinkled between them. A side effect of this is that sometimes you end up having to backtrack a pretty good distance to the last settlement you massacred so that you can sleep. That is, unless you want to take your chances out in the wild and get ganked in the middle of the night, but this can be somewhat remedied by carrying a sleeping bag if you manage to find one. Soulash is a turn-based game, where movement, attacking, using consumables, and even looking in a certain direction will use up a turn. Most actions will also use stamina, which is replenished by resting, something you can do anywhere and at any time. Being able to rest at any point, including during combat, is balanced by it lowering your fatigue meter. Alongside hunger and thirst, fatigue is a stat that puts a limit on how much combat or traveling you can do before needing to sleep. Putting aside the fact that having a stamina bar and needing to sleep as a demon or lich is a little weird, the mechanic's existence is supposed to encourage you to space out combat encounters by sleeping in between. And although it does do this, the mechanic ends up feeling more like a minor inconvenience than something you put any amount of thought into, as every other aspect of the game gears you towards actively seeking out combat encounters as much as possible. I think the fatigue system is fine, it just fits kind of awkwardly into the game and slows down its otherwise arcade-like gameplay in an attempt to make it more of an RPG. Combat is the most frequent and I guess most important aspect of Soulash, because you do so much of it. The most basic form of combat is walking towards the tile that an enemy is standing on in order to deal damage in the form of a basic attack. This is how most enemies, especially in the early game, will behave towards you, with villagers in particular beelining towards you despite them audibly stating that they are terrified of you. Basic attacks can also be done from range, through equipping a ranged weapon. These can be anything from javelins to bows, and they function exactly how you think they do, and the AI, of course, is also capable of using them. Abilities are the other main way of dealing damage in Soulash. They're equipped on the hotbar and are classified as either damage, mobility, or utility-focused spells. Each class has a pool of abilities that they alone have access to, and once you level up, you're given the choice to pick one of 3 abilities presented to you. One from your class pool, one universally available to all other characters, and one from a randomly selected class pool. This system sucks, and the reason why is because it makes your character progression feel out of your control. RNG systems like these work in roguelikes because they add variety and unpredictableness to each run. They make it fun to experiment with different builds and playstyles and add a freshness to each run that makes the game replayable. Soulash doesn't have this replayability because you tend to want the same few abilities on every character no matter the build or class. Abilities you're offered on level up can vary wildly in their usefulness to you, with most either being underwhelming or sometimes useless for your build. Leveling up, I often found myself gunning for abilities I knew were useful from previous runs, and never really felt tempted to try anything else. Abilities that you want to prioritize are ones with any sort of crowd control, range damage, and at least one for mobility. Experimentation is further discouraged by the fact that leveling up takes forever after the first few levels and the game starts to feel like quite a grind. I think the leveling and progression system in Soulash leaned too heavily into its roguelike aspect. If the game had more useful abilities and was a bit more creative with them, I think the system could have worked. I want to clarify that my problems with the system aren't that some abilities aren't as strong, but rather that a handful of abilities are marginally more useful than anything else in the game. It's normal for games to have a meta, but Soulash feels like you're always picking between 3 unexciting choices with varying degrees of usefulness. The crafting and repair system in Soulash is one that feels like it isn't worth interacting with. The idea is simple. Weapons degrade when you attack with them, and armor along with accessories degrade when you take damage. In order to deal with this, you're meant to find crafting stations throughout the world and repair your equipment at the cost of its maximum durability until you find something better. The funny thing is, you won't have to go too long before you find something better, because 90% of this game is fighting enemies and looting their corpses, which carry weapons that are usually equivalent to whatever it is you're using, if not better. Crafting is done by opening the associated menu with C. Every character starts the game with a few basic recipes, and in order to learn more, you either have to salvage items you've looted or find more recipes scattered throughout the world. The main problem with this system is that it's redundant, because going through the effort to engage with it isn't very rewarding. For starters, being able to craft anything that could be of any value to you is out of your control, as recipes are randomly generated and placed wherever, so the chances of you finding a recipe for something you actually want to craft are at the mercy of the game. Salvaging is meant to alleviate this problem by giving you some agency in learning an item's recipe, but it ends up being equally as redundant as searching for recipes because it's also RNG based. The base chance to learn a recipe through salvaging is 0.5% multiplied by your character's intelligence. The game also adds a flat 5% success chance for the subsequent failed attempts at learning said recipe. To give you an example, my character here has 14 intelligence, meaning he has a 7% chance of learning how to make a pair of sandals after destroying these ones. Unfortunately for him, he fails to salvage them and is unable to conceptualize the idea of open-toed shoes, but now the chance of learning the recipe has gone up to 12%. The reality of trying to salvage items is that you end up having to find a lot of one specific item in order to learn the recipe, while in the meantime you've already looted better equipment than whatever it is you're trying to craft, as you're constantly running into higher level enemies which carry better loot. The Necromancer is a class that, to me, seemed more appealing than the others because of its unlimited summon count. Any game that advertises a limitless number of summons seems to me like it puts a good deal of importance on that feature and how the game is built around it. I spent a decent amount of time on 2 Necromancer characters, and the conclusion I've come to about the class is that it's strong, but kind of tedious to play as. Necromancers have 2 core spells that they start with. Raise Zombie, which is used on a corpse to, summon a zombie, and Command Allies, which commands said zombies to attack enemies in or move to a selected area. The disappointing part of these abilities is that for most of the game, they might be your only abilities directly related to summoning anything. The strength of an enemy, or as a matter of fact, what it is that you kill in Soulash, has no effect on what it'll be resurrected as. As long as there is a corpse, whether it be that of a bat or a literal god, using Raise Zombie will summon one with the exact same stats as every other zombie in the game. As far as I know, the only way to get better summons is to roll for them at levels 7 and 11 respectively. So until then, get used to your screen being very green. At least they all have names. The part about playing a Necromancer that irks me is dealing with the summons themselves. If you want to resurrect a corpse, you need to click on it and use the Raise Dead spell, which doesn't work if there's anything standing on the same tile as the corpse. In the early game, this is trivial, but it quickly becomes a problem when you have an army of summons following you around that don't really care about the fact that they're trampling over the corpses you want to resurrect. Since there's no wait action in this game, besides, looking in different directions until the turn ends, the only way I managed to deal with this was by commanding the horde to stand somewhere else and strafing back and forth until they moved out of the way. Summons also block line of sight. The obvious way around this would be moving to an angle where your spells are unobstructed, but this only works when your target isn't getting the Dark Souls 2 treatment and is completely surrounded. When that happens, your options are to sit and wait for your summons to slowly surround the target and eat him alive, in the same way a man carrying any sort of jewelry would be devoured when walking the streets of Bulgaria, or walk into melee range and start tanking, so you can deal damage and not have to wait 13 years for combat to finish. I feel like Soulash is a game that I wanted to like. I realize that most of this video has been me criticizing the game, but the reason for that is I felt that the longer I played it, the less I enjoyed it. The main problem is that the game doesn't have the mechanics to make a good roguelike, and the world isn't engaging enough to make it a good RPG. This leaves it in a sort of murder hobo limbo where you just walk around and kill things, which gets boring kind of quickly. A common piece of criticism I saw from the 5 people that play this game is that the control scheme is bad. And while I kind of agree that the controls are a little clunky and take some getting used to, it surprises me that the controls are a main focus of this game's criticism when things like its core gameplay loop, crafting, and leveling systems are in the discussion. Lastly, the game has a sequel, which seems like it improves on a lot of things, and leans more into being a colony sim while still keeping its RPG roguelike roots. But I will leave that for another day. Thank you for watching.